Oh, um, all right. So before I begin today, I would like to acknowledge that I work on the lands of the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation and of the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognize the continuity of knowledge that nurtures country and community on these lands. And I also acknowledge that these lands were never ceded. So my name is Ewan, and I'm a research associate and teaching assistant at Macquarie University. And I'd like to thank the track organisers for putting on these seminars. And I can confirm there's nowhere I'd rather be at 3 a.m. in the morning than spreading some love for theory and Roman archaeology. Um, this talk today is based off parts of my PhD dissertation, which I've tried to distill into a 45-minute talk. So if anyone would like to read this thesis, it's now on available open access via the Macquarie University Warrenora Library. I have a QR code on the final page, but you can also send me an email if you want the one with all the pretty pictures in it. In addition to thanking my three wonderful supervisors, Dr. Daniel Gino, Professor Ray Lawrence, and Professor Simon James, also note that this research was funded by an Australian government research training partnership scholarship and supported by the Macquarie University Department of History and Archaeology, Gale Greco-Roman Travelling Fellowship, and the 2022 Croatian Studies Foundation Community Culture and Research Grant Scheme. So without further ado, let's jump into some posthumanist novelties. So in 2011, hidden away in a humble footnote, Simon James made a statement that has profoundly shaped my research and continues to shape my research, which is that all fields of study need to, from time to time, to re-examine and overhaul their basic concepts and be prepared to abandon the inadequate and outdated for better ones, and that may radically shift and improve our perspective. Here I know James is particularly speaking to his earlier efforts to encourage fellow scholars of Roman military studies to experiment methodologically and theoretically to broaden their understanding of life alongside, and against Rome's armies. Such an endeavor was particularly important around the turn, within the context of the Roman military studies, at the turn of the millennium, because as James observed earlier in relation to Britain specifically, the work of Roman military scholars was and still is widely seen as narrow, unimaginative, unconcerned with theory, and stagnant in methodology. Now, thanks to the efforts of scholars such as James and others, this is no longer the case, at least I firmly believe so, and Roman military studies has indeed expanded its remit and its methodologies. More than 2 decades earlier, two French thinkers, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, were also shifting fields, in their case, metaphysics, continental philosophy, and psychoanalysis. In A Thousand Plateaus, of which you can see my tired copy on the slide there, these two philosophers speak of thinking, writing, and doing things like a rhizome, the unorganized root networks of ginger, essentially experimenting with making connections which reach out from one arrangement of things towards another, all in the hope of becoming something else or unearthing something novel in the process. As they say, the core of their assemblage thinking is this principle. Any point of a rhizome can be connected to anything other and must be. These connections, or rather the acts of making them, are referred to as lines of flight, and their experimental essence underpins their entire philosophy. So in this paper, as I did in my thesis, I connect these seemingly far-removed assertions, one from an archaeologist concerned for the future of his field, and another from two thinkers concerned with anti-individualism and capitalism. I do so by mapping out my own line of flight into the resonance between Roman military studies and assemblage thinking, connecting two concepts central to each. The first being the Roman army as a community, and the second being assemblage. And I look to what this connection between these two concepts can reveal about how the more than human mattered in Rome Dalmatia. So what was the idea of the Roman military, or what is the idea of the Roman military community? So around the turn of the millennium, we have a move away from the mechanistic views of the Roman military, which were popular for most of the 20th century, which were very top-down and hierarchical and bounded, and viewed the Roman military operating as a kind of machine. And this has shifted towards an idea that still acknowledges its top-down hierarchy and administrative fabric, but also sees it as several overlapping communities or groups, social groups at least. This includes things like the community of the soldier, which is this kind of idea that all soldiers across the empire had an imagined sense of community with one another. And there's things like the extended community of servicemen, of ex-servicemen, non-combatants, paramilitaries, family members, and so on. And there is also a very strong idea that social life is built by the people within the communities. So, social life emerges from the actions of the people. So this reconstruction and approach to the Roman military embraces difference, elevates soldiers from cogs in the machine, unearths and has unearthed the supposedly faceless blobs of the extended community, and moved beyond the top-down hierarchical views of life in the military world. And scholarship of this subfield, if you will, indeed acknowledges and has for some time that things like space, place, objects, and signs are important to social life. Gardner, for instance, saw the dwelling and consumption practices of mid to late Roman military communities in Britain as impactful in defining their identities. And elsewhere, studies of activities in camp spaces have similarly considered archaeological materials as the outcomes of practice and action, with Alberti, for example, seeing the adaptation of spindle whorls at Vindolanda as evidence for women actively involved in identity construction. So one thing's for sure, any future framework deployed to advance our understanding of Roman military communities, any lines of flight, if you will, must work from these works and the essence, and remain true to this essence of this subfield, which is to maintain an ability to engage with diversity and complexity, and to embrace the potential for bottom-up approaches to life in, around, or against the military. So one such potential, the one that I'm engaging with today, is a post-anthropocentric engagements with the more than human, i.e. engagements that do not put humans at the center, but embed them amongst the spaces, signs, objects, animals, and more that were also vital to the social dynamics of military life. There are two things that I will engage with today in this regard. First, in scholarship in Roman archaeology in general, there is a focus on the socio-symbolic capacities of objects, specifically, often, their meanings and representations and how these relate to identity. This typically centers around humans producing signs, symbols, identities, and so on onto or with inert materials, which I think, and many others agree, undersells the place of the more than human. Studies of social life need to be more than just about conscious representation, seeing the process instead as one that inherently involves the more than human, and is also only one of the many ways the more than human can matter in the ancient world. The second and somewhat related area of enrichment relates to practice, which is typically understood as the process whereby social fabric is created through action. And again, the focus is typically upon how people create culture through practice and how things are outcomes of this process, rather than how people come together with other things to do this. Things and their materiality there must have also been a factor in social life, as is becoming increasingly evident elsewhere in Roman studies, such as in regard to the spread and proliferation of general styles of ceramics, as studied by Astrid Bonoyan, or the empire-wide negotiation of and emergence of religious knowledges, as illustrated recently by Emma Jane Graham. Thankfully, I think Roman military studies is well positioned to make this transition. We have an increasingly extensive, detailed, and geographically widespread understanding of the more than human, with in-depth studies and catalogs of objects, materials, landscapes, and even more recently, zooarchaeological evidence being the bread and butter of this field. Now, I'm well aware that posthumanism has not been without detractors who have argued, amongst other things, that it reduces humans to the same as everything else, or even that it is not interested in the humans at all, and we're returning back to the pots equal people paradigm. In Roman archaeology specifically, scholars have expressed concerns about the ethical and political implications, namely that it will diminish our ability to engage with the darker sides of Roman imperialism. Assemblage thinking does not, however, wish to remove humans or deny impacts upon the world or their impacts on the world. Indeed, I wholeheartedly agree with the supposed detractors here that in the face of our environmental, social, and political crises, we must not do this. Instead, assemblage thinking advocates for an appreciation of the complexity of human life or becoming, and how this is always with other things and beings. For example, agency in assemblage thinking is emergent from a wider assemblage or network of things, events, beings, and so on. And although it therefore undoubtedly exists, if we ever seek to explain how things occurred or why they occurred, we must account for this wider assemblage of things as well as humans' intentional action, or even better, how the two are intrinsically linked. So what is assemblage thinking, or assemblage theory as it's often known? Well, it's a broad collection of post-humanist and post-structuralist scholarship which seeks to entangle humans within their broader contexts and problematize things like agency, individualism, power, and structure. At the center are the philosophers Deleuze and Guattari, who I've already mentioned, and their concept of assemblage. However, many scholars from a range of fields have since adapted and adopted their philosophy elsewhere. This is why I like to use thinking instead of theory, for it is thinking with assemblages that unites these sometimes very different approaches. The intents and purposes of archaeologists nowhere are assemblage thinking principles and methods laid out better than in the work of Oliver Harris, and I follow his overall understanding of assemblage theory with some slight tweaks here and there, including a bit of an influence from the critical theorist Ian Buchanan. So assemblage thinking is founded upon several central philosophical concepts which can move us away from static, human-centering and closed-off conceptualizations of life. The ones I'll discuss today are universality, desire, immanence, becoming, and multiplicity. And I don't want to spend too much time on them, but I'm just going to briefly summarize the worldview that they maintain. Pardon me. Essentially, working from these principles, the world is seen as a mess of matter wherein there are no hierarchies a priori. The universe is, in other words, univocal. All matter also seeks out connections, it desires, and on account of this constant surging of matter, all things occur immanently within the moment, with no transcendental forces at play. All is historically contextualized. On account of this desire and immanence, one must continually think about change, and assemblage thinking is therefore concerned with becoming over what instead of what something is being, moving away from what something is towards what it is doing, the connections it has, how this can and does evolve, and the potentials for change that this creates. Um, Another key idea in assemblage thinking is that all is multiple. A whole thing always comprises multiple things, and these component things are also irreducible to one another and their place in the whole, emphasizing that things can have many relations and that one need not make claims to singular truths, all-encompassing identities, or singular ways of being. Now, this is a lot of word vomit essentially, but what it means for archaeologists is that we must study the ongoing processes of connection and coherence visible in the historical record or context, sorry, or prehistoric, that we are studying, as well as instances of disconnection and decoherence. And how do we do this? Well, with assemblages, of course. Assemblages or agencement, which is my preferred term, but I'll refrain from using today. I just find that assemblages, we already have assemblages in archaeology, so it can get a bit confusing. Nevertheless, assemblages are often presented as things or collections of things. However, this misses the point somewhat, actually, for assemblages are the processes of rearrangement that produce things, and they are the systems behind both the processes and the resulting things, inextricable from both. Again, I'm going to avoid giving too much jargon and focus instead on just how they work. And if I encounter concepts later, I'll define them a bit better. So stripped to their simplest elements, assemblages are open processes that relationally de and rearrange semiotic and material components at many scales. The coming together, splitting apart, moving, and coding or entangling of these components and various bodies makes differences in the world, channeling or machining the aforementioned desire of connection towards certain ends. Each assemblage has a unique diagram or unifying principle which informs and is informed by its contents and connections. For instance, our culturally situated knowledge of furniture, a person's aching body after a day's work, and the physical properties of a chair could be understood as the sitting down assemblage. And these things come together to produce an outcome or tangible thing, that is, a seated individual. And in doing so, they inform what unifies these many components in this assemblage. That is what it means to sit and be sat, to use an example from Oliver Harris. So, as Buchanan goes at lengths to stress, we must remember that assemblages and their incumbent concepts are tools with which we analyze the world around us. They are means of exploring how things cohere and break apart, which is what Deleuze and Guattari were interested in. And what this boils down to methodologically is a relatively straightforward method of delineation, relation, mapping, and definition. One must map out the scales and components of the assemblages one is interested in, including the many layers and contents across it. One must then study the relations and interactions between these components and the consequent processes of motion and rearrangement, or incoherence and coherence, and then map out how these relations and processes capture and channel desire to certain ends, and from that build a diagram of the assemblage, essentially mapping out what it does and what potentials it has. And throughout all of this, one must bring together the various principles and concepts I defined above, which may seem unwieldy, but is the only effective way to do this. even when working with one particular concept or one looking at one particular component within the assemblage. The main thing is to start with an issue or thing and tackle it straight on. So let us return to the Roman military community again, which I'll now briefly rehash as an assemblage in a kind of abstract sense. Um, so communities are twofold. They emerge out of the social relations and interactions between humans, animals, things, and more, and they subsequently shape these interactions. They are, in other words, and as I spend much more time explaining my thesis, distinct kinds of assemblages which produce and shape social life. They are both a thing and a process. This means they comprise of events and practices and the many bodies, be they human, signs, and more than human things and beings, which come into contact during these events and practices. So Roman military was primarily a collection of human bodies and groups of bodies doing things in distinct ways. It comprised many overlapping groups, including its armies and their extended communities of non-combatants, all interacting with each other and many other people and things in countless settings inside and outside the confines of camps. These events of interaction and rearrangement occurred at many scales across military life simultaneously. Soldiers were disciplined through training, families lived in extramural settlements and were involved in the supply of the armies. Units made dedications to deities from far removed cities. Food was prepared together in a contubernum, and so on. However, its bodies did not stop there, including myriad objects, spaces, beings, animals, plants, symbols, values, ideas, and so on, all of which would come into contact during these events and interactions, or similar ones, like beer consumed in military camps, cattle reared en masse to feed the armies, coins used to pay the soldiers, ideas of masculinity, living spaces such as within military camps, important items of dress, and so on. These communities were also embedded within wider Roman society, open to new gods and deities, foodstuffs, ways of dressing, speaking, acting, and thinking. Now, these events and bodies were not only part of communal life, they were parts of other types of life as well, but they were a part of the communal assemblage. Remember, in assemblage thinking, everything can be multiple or is multiple. The task of the analyst is to unpack how certain things were implicit to communal life. So, in sum, a multi-scaled system of social life produces a Roman military community. These communities intersected and arose from the lives of soldiers, veterans, extended community members, officers, and as we'll see, even the emperors themselves, and emerged from their experiences with others and other things in the military world. These groups of people and things were caught up with each other in communal life, but crucially not wholly defined by it. Now, I promised that in my thesis I contextualize this overview and reconstruction with a broad range of evidence from the first 3 centuries. However, that was admittedly abstract, so now I'm going to give this concrete application, and also having now sketched out or delineated the wider context or assemblage, I can now look to analyze its components. And although animals, landscapes, and other beings were equally implicit to military life, what I'm going to do is focus on how select objects in Roman Dalmatia were vital to specific dimensions of communal life. So one such dimension of military life was the place of the emperor and his household. I've always been quite taken by John Lennon's argument that the Roman government was not wholly or even primarily an abstraction to the Roman populace. It was people and relationships, and therefore it was social. A particularly important relationship in this regard was between the soldier and the emperor. Even by the end of Augustus's reign, the principate was grounded in acceptance rather than dynasticism, or purely dynasticism. As put forward by Lendon, this relationship was largely constituted of rich coercive networks of discipline, honor, and obligation, and extended from the emperors through their commanders to the soldiers and back again. In his address to the cohorts at Lambaesis in Algeria in 128, for instance, Hadrian makes frequent reference to the honor or manhood of his officers, particularly the legate, when he's praising the skill and honor of the assembled soldiers, as seen with this excerpt praising the skills of the sixth cohort, Comaganorum, and you can see the reference of virtus or manhood. The emperor and his imperial power, or rather the flows which led to him, were contingent upon this relationship. Now, this system of honor and obligation flowed in several directions, like a complex root system behind a hierarchy. Officers, commanders, and even the emperors were routinely subject to the expectations of their soldiers. Aside from moments of mutiny, this is most apparent in instances involving emperors sharing in the labors of their troops, such as Trajan and Hadrian, who are recorded in literary sources as having marched with their soldiers But it's also, I would argue, evident in all of the military iconography that we see emperors dressing in their images. And so the emperor and his imperial power, or rather the flows of power which led to him, were contingent upon this relationship with the soldiers and the perceived importance of this relationship by the soldiers. But the emperor couldn't be everywhere at once. Even Hadrian, that seemingly ever traveling emperor. So how else was this system sustained? How was the emperor manifest in military life? And his centrality in the honor network reaffirmed? There must have been an entire assemblage at work, or several. Now, religion was no doubt one domain, but awards and benefactions, such as monetary and ornamental honors, so donativa and militaris, must have played a role, garnering loyalty and fashioning obligation. And it was not just the act of awarding these honors, which had social implications, for the awards themselves continued to elicit effect long beyond conferral. Falaire, for instance, were military discs or medallions made of glass or metal, often awarded in sets of nine. The more ornately decorated Falaire could bear busts of the emperors and members of his household, as well as other things like deities and animals. Particularly common were blue-green glass Falaire from the Julio-Claudian period, which comprised a glass disc surrounded by a plated rim inside a bronze fitting. These seem to have been relatively standardized and centrally produced, and have been discovered in the Rhinish and Gallic provinces, along with Britannia, Italia, Pannonia, and elsewhere, including Dalmatia, where three fragmented examples of such Falaire have been discovered, all published in great detail by Zrinka Ludovic in 2013. One fragment from the legionary camp at Burnham, modern Ivolshevitsi, has been interpreted to depict Tiberius in military uniform with a cloak and a sword belt, and was likely created between 4 and 14 CE based on portrait. Two other examples are more fragmentary, but are of a type thought to depict an armored Tiberius flanked by Drusus the Younger and Germanicus, dating from around 14 to the death of Drusus in 19. One fragment was found at the military camp of Tellurium in modern Gardun, and the other smaller fragment is held in the archaeological collection of the Franciscan monastery in Seen, which is in the surrounding region. So these were likely awarded to soldiers serving under Tiberius, perhaps for exploits in the Bellum Battonianum, which occurred between 6 and 9 CE in Illyricum and was a catalyst for the eventual split into Dalmatia and Pannonia. They would have been worn, these medallions, by members of the Dalmatian garrison when in full military dress and perhaps in combat, and it's therefore possible they were not an uncommon sight in many settings like parades and religious rites. As these Falaire came into contact with other bodies, humans and non-human, this would have brought about effects in particular ways. Focusing on the emperor and his household, for instance, these representations would have inserted this household and their social relationships into the military spaces and practices, transporting the figures of Tiberius Drusus and Germanicus. At an individual level, when handled by the awardee, the Falaire may have brought forth memories of the events that surrounded their conferral or award. As one may experience with a postcard or a photo album, the Falaire here would have been implicit to the emergence of particular sensations. Their striking colour may also have been quite stark against the rest of the soldiers' panoply, garnering the attention of onlookers, which would have had further effects, perhaps bringing forth memories of previous interactions with the emperors or their household, including the visit of Drusus to Illyricum between after 17 CE, when he was sent specifically to garner the military favor, if Tacitus is to be believed anyway. Additionally, as donor, such as Falaire, were awarded for acts of courage, and as is more pertinent to what we're talking about today, these depictions of the imperial household would have further entangled these figures with this important virtue, this prowess and honor obligation system, and its acquisition, and the acquisition of honor and things like virtus, that manhood I mentioned. Indeed, Dona would have reinforced the very importance of things like virtus and honor, further redefining the distinct military network of honor and obligation, which was described by Lendon as being its own world with its own intense satisfaction, its own singular code, and its own honor. An assemblage of military honor, if you will. Thus, the coming together of humans and Falaire folded different temporal, spatial, emotive, and physical scales together in one moment in time, or rather, they had the capacity to do this, to bring Tiberius and his family to Dalmatia, as it were, and into the communal lives of its garrison. This folding reinserted the Roman imperial household into military life, further entrenching their status as patrons of the soldiers and their communities. Behind this were two assemblages, that of the imperial household and that of the military honor system. Through Valere, these assemblages converged and impacted military communal life and became entangled in this social assemblage. However, we should not see these in isolation, for many components are at play in processes of re-entanglement such as this, or stratification, as Deleuze and Guattari would call it. The prevalence of the emperor, his household, the importance of their relationship with the military, and the continuation of the honor system are no different in this regard. Coinage was another means by which the imperial household was reterritorialized, that is, transported into the military and their place at the center of the honor network reaffirmed, with pay or donatives placing them directly in the palms of soldiers' hands, and their images, intended or not, to have the capacity to reinforce the status quo. Looking again to Dalmatia, a coin from Caligula was discovered in a hoard from Tellurium depicting the emperor upon a podium giving ad locutio, or an address to his assembled soldiers. These addresses involve instances where the soldiers were praised directly by the emperor or his family, as seen with Hadrian in Lambaesis or Drusus in Illyricum. Sometimes they also involved the bestowing of awards, pay, and rituals. And coins such as these had the capacity to bundle up these events and the emotional effects that they elicited to be brought forth when they were handled by soldiers or even members of the wider community who may have been onlookers at these events. Moreover, other things like funerary monuments were similarly constitutive of this honor system and its bundled effects, as seen with these two first-century stelae or funerary stelae from Tellurium and Burnham, respectively, which depict various items of military awards, such as falerae, but also things like torques. And there are two things I want to stress here. First, that coins such as this and similar ones reveal that it was not just the representations of the emperors themselves that were impactful, but also the physical affordances of the objects upon which they were depicted. A coin was light and highly movable, and was handled by its users, allowing these images to move and affect very far and wide. This applies to falerae as well, I would argue. Their physical properties allow them to be worn and thus re-territorialized into many different spaces where bodies interacted. Meanwhile, tombstones, often set up around military bases, remained grand monuments to, amongst many other things, this honor and award and obligation system. Second, it's not just the objects themselves, but their connections to each other, which embedded the emperors and their households in military life. There are several assemblages at play here, or several overlapping processes, including monetary systems, militarism, honor, funeral rites, and so on. And in this instance, all are channeling and tangling the connective tissue of the connective nature of matter, that is the aforementioned concept, principle of desire, towards a particular end, alongside many other ends in other assemblages, but from this perspective, with the connections between various humans and non-human components channeling power through a military honor system to the emperor. But as I've said, assemblage thinking is multiplicious or of the multiple, and many things are therefore involved in many becomings simultaneously. So I'd like to turn to some of the same evidence, namely funerary monuments, but explore another way they were implicit to community emergence in Roman Dalmatia. And I'm going to follow the method again of delineating the assemblage, exploring its contents and how they relate and the effects of these relations. So first I need to delineate a process, one of rearrangement. And for this, I'm going to look to the popularity of monumental funerary commemoration in the Roman military community in Dalmatia. So this graph plots out the distribution of monuments over time, looking to 510 epitaphs from the Latin inscriptions of the Roman Empire database, which refer to members of the military community. Now, for this, I used keywords. And if you're interested in the methodology, the data is all on the slide there, or in the QR code. Now, this may not seem like much, 510 epitaphs, but when accounting for survivability rates that have been proposed, from 1 to 5%, this could perhaps represent a corpus that was originally anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 monuments in size, depending on whose accounts you follow. Although epigraphic dates are notoriously unreliable and or variable, particularly in online databases, this graph shows that there was a period of increased setting up of funerary monuments throughout the first century CE. It evidently becomes a popular and established practice in this period, within the military community of Dalmatia. And I will note that the reason for the decline is because the um, there is a demilitarization of the province following the first century. So alongside this, and in the same period, we see the emergence of communal spaces and places, specifically necropolis for members of the military community, both combatants and non-combatants. The legionary camps of Tillerium and Burnham, for example, I've mocked up some approximate locations of the necropolis. These were alongside the roads and highways that ran nearby or through the legionary forts, including in both instances the main highway that ran from Aquileia down to Dyrrhachium, which was essentially northwest to southeast highway across the whole of Dalmatia. And these tombstones and their plots emerged alongside these roads in the classic streets lined with tombs pattern or Groberstrassen as it's called in the German. And this is occurring in the first century CE at the same time as all these monuments being set up. Another military sites, this is occurring as well as in provincial centres such as Salona. But we also see it at auxiliary forts such as Gracine in Ljubuški, which is in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And just south of the auxiliary camp, there was, again, alongside the same main highway I just mentioned, necropolis with many Roman military funerary monuments set up. And all of this, of course, does not just mean that the practice of setting up monuments was becoming popular, but also that the accompanying funerary practices and rites, many of which were also becoming popular. And many of these actually saw commemorators return to the graves of their family and community members during festivals such as the Parentalia, Feralia, and Rosalia, for example. So there's this emergence of spaces and these new practices. So there's a distinct thing cohering in the Roman military communities of Dalmatia in the first century, and that is this practice of setting up inscribed funerary monuments for community members. This stratification would have had myriad implications for social life, because as the contents of communal life change, so too would the capacity for new things to occur. So now that this coherence has been delineated, such processes can be investigated further. And there are several I've discussed in my thesis, namely that the emergence of this new practice would have been integral to the emergence of distinct communal military places, so not just spaces, but senses of place for the military community, both in necropolis next to military camps, but also, as I mentioned, in those other provincial centers like Salona. And they also had a role in bringing people back to these places and spaces to practice community, which is obviously related to also the emergence of place. And then they would also embed the practice of monumental commemoration within communal fabric, making it a popular and important part of communal life, but also were a key component in funerary commemoration becoming an important or at least popular part of life in provincial Dalmatia in general. But what I want to focus on today is signs and how we can just kind of show how we can engage with matters of meaning in posthumanism. And so I'm going to look at how tombstones were vital to the circulation of distinct communal signs and the effects that these signs wielded. So for this, I'd like to look at funerary stelae with reliefs of cavalrymen or Reitertypen, as they're sometimes known, which are very well-studied type of tombstone. And I want to look at their place in the semiotic processes of military life or the symbolic processes. There are more than a dozen of these in Dalmatia, dating to the first and early to mid-second centuries, with most coming from military camps. Here there are three examples. One from Gracine, dedicated to potentially a Galatian eques named Tures, which depicts a cavalryman at charge, or at least in a triumphal pose. And then there's another next to it, also from Gracine, with the inscription now lost, with a similar pose. And then we have an example from Narona, which is to the southeast of Gracine. Gracine protects the highway into the city of Narona. And in this, there is another cavalryman, the name of whom is lost, riding down a mother and child. Now, what I want to argue is that funerary cavalry reliefs like these rearranged and recontextualized key components from daily life and bundled them into potential communally significant signs. Now, which relations between objects, events, and bodies were brought forth during the process of signification or meaning making? Depends on the process of interpretation and was dependent upon those interacting with the monument, which, as Deleuze and Guattari remind us, is a process situated in the assemblage. To explore what this might have looked like, then I'm going to interpret these monuments from the perspective of a member of the military community. And one of the things one can hypothesize is that the servicemen and extended community members who interacted with these monuments considered their reliefs and the relations, components, and events that they referenced to relate to, amongst many other things, military virtus or military prowess as well. Mentioned earlier, this military virtus or martial virtus was a distinct concept of manhood expressed through courage and prowess in combat and military matters. And it was a social value woven into military life through other things like military awards, as I've discussed. And I would argue that this virtus, along with other forms of martial prowess, could be brought forth or deterritorialized in these reliefs of triumphant, warring, and rearing riders. There's a tongue twister for you. With the apparent prowess, courage, and/or manhood of the deceased recreated by these reliefs. In these instances, the distinct combination of bodies, namely that of a horse and a rider, would also have meant that this understanding of virtus was related to a distinctly equestrian form of military virtus and prowess. And this particular process of signification, which spoke to equestrian virtus or prowess, may have been particularly potent in the necropolis around military camps where members of the military community were more likely to interact with the monument and their own experiences of discipline or combat, which was not a given, and training and parading, perhaps leading them to interpret the sign in a similar fashion, reaching out to these things from the wider assemblage. So there are two things I want to stress about this, or the effects of this. So by highlighting the relationships and experiences distinct to the lives of cavalrymen and their attendants and their communities, there is the potential for these monuments to stand as agents of differentiation within the community, contributing towards the emergence of a distinct cavalryman becoming, which involved a distinct form of military virtus opposed to those on foot, for example. However, at the same time, they are simultaneously sustaining the importance of military prowess across the entire military community, part of a repetitive process whereby this prowess is established as a key value. Indeed, secondly, if these reliefs were indeed interpreted to represent martial prowess, the virtus, or at least prowess, and a distinctly cavalryman flavor at that, then by circulating these signs, the monuments were also active in the re-embedding of this understanding of virtus and prowess back into communal life as an important value, particularly at sites such as the necropolis south of Gratiné, where at least four such monuments were set up. The repetition of these signs would have entrenched ideas of equestrian prowess and skill into communal fabric. And so, from this perspective, these reliefs do not just represent the status of the deceased as a cavalryman, the idea of a cavalryman, or the martial values associated with this position. They were instead active in the regeneration of these very things. In this instance, they may have helped sustain and define military virtus, ensuring the salience of this militaristic ideal within the community for decades or even centuries to come. This two-part process is what Deleuze and Guattari, or Deleuze specifically, would call difference and repetition, which is creating difference repetitively to create similarity. So military life was also a story of human and other animal relationships, which is particularly true, obviously, for our cavalrymen like Tourès. The relationship between horses and humans was likely central in the lives of cavalrymen and their extended community, with much of their lives spent alongside, around, and with horses. This relationship reached beyond riding, trading, grooming, feeding, grazing, watering, and just treating ailments, because soldiers, attendants, slaves, and where present, family members occupied the same barrack blocks as horses in so-called stable barracks, which consisted of two rows of rooms, a barrack and a stable. The vicinity of the latter, which would have created a distinct living arrangement, olfactorily and thermally, if nothing else, if you catch my drift. Such structures, to my knowledge, have not been discovered in Dalmatia as of yet, but the military installations in Dalmatia are not fully excavated or even, studied by other means. So they may appear. And nevertheless, cavalry equipment has been found in great numbers at most, if not all, military sites during the first century CE in Dalmatia. And it's safe to assume that the relationship between horse and humans comprised a significant part of the communal life of both parties and was a chief component or important component of the social assemblages for mounted units and their extended communities. So these reliefs would have had the capacity to relate to this shared experience and be interpreted within this communal context, wherein relationships between horse and human were central. Indeed, these reliefs, again, are not just symbols of this, but outcomes and architects of it. Just observed with equestrian prowess, these and similar funerary cavalry reliefs reaffirmed the importance of this human-horse relationship, bringing not just the horse, but a distinct human-horse relationship into communal life. Moreover, these reliefs themselves should be seen as the outcome of this close relationship, with the practices and experiences of uh, communal life channeling desire, that principle of connection, to this end, and the prevalence of the want to present this kind of relationship in funerary art. So for some members of the military community, oh, sorry, go back one. This could have referenced and re-established things like military roles or ranks and status, as stressed before, or for others, it may have signified the deep connection they felt with their horse companions. Regardless, whatever the interpretation was, the human-horse relationship itself, the distinct becoming of this shared becoming between these two beings, was further entwined in communal life through their presentation on these monuments, which do not just speak to the more than human nature of communal life in the Roman military, but actually evidently grew out of it and defined it. These rite signs would have affected differently, though, throughout and beyond the military community. So finally, I think it's important to briefly stress this point about assemblages being open, or what Deleuze and Guattari called having the nature of exteriority, essentially externalness. And the stele from Nerona, for example, in its potentially civilian setting, southeast of Gratiné, just I believe it was found just to the north of the part of the city of Nerona, as well as the monuments near Gratiné, which were set up alongside the main highway that I already mentioned, would have incited different notions for the many people who passed and interacted with them. Potential relations within their signs would have been very different for a member of the local indigenous population, for example, particularly in the early to mid first century CE, when memories of Roman conquest were fresh. The unnamed cavalryman in the stele from the Rona, as I've already said, is at full charge with his spear raised, running down a fleeing woman and a child. And here, and upon the other stele, there is therefore this capacity for violence to be recreated. And this would have entrenched imperial violence into, or had the potential to entrench imperial violence into the local landscape, as well as incite memories of this violence amongst local onlookers. And this serves as a reminder of the fact that military life and the components of military life, like these funerary monuments and the violence that they glorify, affected the lives of others. Indeed, components of military communal life were probably much more likely to do this than others, considering the significant and generational impacts of things like conquest and violence, conquest and violence, things like mass death, generational trauma, cultural loss, displacement, and in this example, the monumentalization of these things. So assemblage thinking allows us to engage with this multiplicious nature of Roman military life and material culture and engage with these effects and more. So to end, I want to return to the two quotes that I started today, or the essence of these, which I have yoked together today, leaping into Roman archaeology from the reverberations between them, offering an example of what happens when the archaeology of the Roman military is connected with posthumanism. So connecting, Simon James's call for novel ideas to be added, and Deleuze and Guattari's idea that any point of the rhizome can be connected to anything other and must be. And doing so, I've demonstrated that becoming, communal or otherwise, always comprises more than human components. Military social life was lived alongside many things, with relations between humans and more than humans reaching across and beyond the many layers of daily life, from a single falera to the emperor himself, or a tombstone to a horse, to the horse-human relationship distinct to cavalry units. Objects were vital to the social dynamics of military life, becoming becoming significant, bringing bodies together, and forging new social relationships and things and placing them within communal fabric in specific ways. These capacities were not on account of some innate power within these more than human things, rather, they emerge from the coming together and moving apart of bodies and the connections that this creates, through which desire can then be channeled towards social life with other things, or communal becoming, as I like to call it. Moreover, this is but one outcome of these relationships, with the effects of Roman military communal life spilling well beyond its own bounds and being related to several other assemblages of militarism, religion, honor, imperialism, and so on. So probably my favorite quote ever, the critical theorist Brian Masumi writes that a concept is a brick. It can be used to build the courthouse of reason, or it can be thrown through the window. And today, using the concept of assemblage, I like to think that I have renovated, if you will, the Roman military community as inherently more than human. Assemblage thinking has helped reveal that Roman military communities comprised humans, other beings, and things, all caught up in the throes of becoming with one another. Life was and always will be more than just humans together. To use the words of the poet Kathleen Stewart, it is much more complicated and much more rooted in things. So, to conclude, I implore you all to pick up a conceptual brick from time to time and see where it can take you. Thank you.